Hello, Kids at Hope family. I pray you are doing well today. Pastor Logan here with our parent video for the week of April 21st. And our lesson this week is titled Joseph Saved His Family. And so we'll continue looking at the life of Joseph and how God has brought him to this position of authority in Egypt, where God will use him to care for Joseph's family, Israel's family, and how God will continue keeping his covenant he made way back with Abraham through the life and family of Joseph. And so last week we saw that Joseph interpreted some dreams. He interpreted the dreams of the cupbearer and the baker, saying that the cupbearer would be reinstated into service of Pharaoh and the baker would be executed. And those interpretations came true, just as God told Joseph they would. And then 2 years later, the cupbearer finally remembers Joseph when Pharaoh himself has some dreams. And so Joseph is brought before Pharaoh, and he interprets the dreams that Pharaoh had, saying that they meant that Egypt would have 7 years of plenty, where there was lots of food available, and then 7 years of famine, where food would be scarce. And so Joseph recommended keeping a portion of that food back during those plenty years, and then having that available to use during the years of famine. So Pharaoh appoints Joseph to be the one in charge of that project and really elevates him to be the second in command of Egypt. And so Joseph is going about that work of storing up the food and then having it available during the famine. And so in our story this week, we'll see how Joseph's brothers come looking for food, wanting to buy food, and how their interactions and the ways that that plays out results in Joseph's family moving to Egypt, and how God is providing for his nation, Israel, through these hardships that Joseph went to, leading to him being in this position of power to care for his family. So we'll see Joseph working in these 7 years, collecting the portion of the food to have it on hand during the years of famine. And the famine was widespread, not just in Egypt, but in many, many lands. And so Joseph opened up the storehouses to sell food for anybody who would need it. And so Jacob, Joseph's father, and Joseph's brothers were still living in Canaan. And so Jacob told his brothers, told his sons to go to Egypt and buy food, because he knew that Egypt had food available. But Jacob was still mourning the loss of Joseph, and so he kept his youngest son, Benjamin, back with him at home and sent the other brothers on ahead. And so Joseph recognizes his brothers when they come to buy grain, and there's some interactions where Joseph tests his brothers to see if their hearts have changed. He certainly remembers how they treated him with throwing him in the pit, selling him into slavery. And so Joseph wants to see if they have learned, if they have grown, if their hearts are different. And so eventually he sees that, yes, they are different men. They are willing to give themselves in the place of their youngest brother, Benjamin. And so Joseph reveals his identity, shows his brothers that he is their long-lost brother that they sold into slavery. And so the brothers are in awe of Joseph. Certainly a big shocker to them, thinking that their brother certainly had died, or at the very least would have been sold into some far-off, distant country. But here he is in Egypt in this powerful position. And then I'm sure those thoughts of awe were quickly followed by fear. Now Joseph is in this great position of power. How is he going to deal with us? How will he treat us? But we see that Joseph shows them kindness, that Joseph forgives his brothers, and he says a very well-known line, well-known verse, that what you meant for evil, the Lord meant for good, and God used for good. So all these hardships, from being hurt by his brothers and sold into slavery and thrown into prison after being lied about, and then being in prison for years, all those hardships and difficulties, that God never forgot Joseph. God never gave up on Joseph. And actually, God was using those situations to bring Joseph to this position of power to then be able to care for Israel, God's people. So Joseph invites his father Jacob and his younger brother Benjamin and all of their families to come live in Egypt so that they can be sustained through this famine. And so then we see Joseph, before he dies, reminding his family of the promises of God, reminding them that God's covenant is still trustworthy and active, and how God is moving in their situation to continue protecting his people, that God promises he will keep a remnant or a group, a small group of his people, that he will continue to watch over his people, not let them die out. And so God is faithful to his promises. And so we see that the Pharaoh that Joseph was under passes away, and then a new generation comes who forgets about the God of Israel. And so we see the Israelites coming into slavery, being oppressed by the Egyptians, and yet they multiply. Their nation grows in number, and so God is still moving and working in light of these difficult situations. And so we see that through the family of Judah, the fourth son of Jacob, eventually down the line, that's the line that Jesus Christ comes through. So we're continuing to see God being true to his covenant, leading and pointing to and preparing the way for Jesus. So the specifics about this story, as we mentioned, the title is Joseph Saved His Family, and the passages to focus on this week are Genesis 42 through 46 and chapter 50. And so it might be a good week to maybe read a chapter over the next 5 or 6 days, being able to navigate this story over the course of the week. The story point for for this week, still trying to get out of the weekly mindset. The story point for this week is God sent Joseph to Egypt to establish a remnant. So Joseph is in position of power to care for his family, and God will protect a portion of his family to continue his covenant coming. The key passage, and this would be the memory verse for this week, is Hosea 13:4, which says, "I have been the Lord your God ever since the land of Egypt. You know no God but me, and no Savior exists besides me." So great truth to remember. Our big picture question and answer continues to be, is there anything God cannot do? And the answer is God can do all things according to his character. Then the Christ connection for this week, the way this story points us to Jesus, is God had a plan for Joseph's life. He allowed Joseph to suffer, and through that suffering, God rescued the nation of Israel. And in a much greater way, God planned for Jesus to suffer so that many people from all nations would come and be saved through the sacrifice of Jesus from their sin. So another wonderful story that points us to Jesus, points us to the cross. And I will be praying for you this week as you engage with this story with your kids, working through these chapters and these details as we continue to rejoice and celebrate God's goodness. I love you guys so much, continuing to miss you, and I do hope you have a great week together as a family, and I look forward to seeing you again next week.